Okay. All right, perfect. So let's get started. So first of all, guys, welcome everybody. Oh, there we go. We got some more guys on. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for attending this masterclass with my good buddy Sabrina Andrews and my favorite mental health professional. So before we get started, I'll just give Sabrina a quick introduction, and I'll let her fill in the blanks. But I'll tell you why I guess my relationship with Sabrina is important to me. And it's because she and I had a conversation, it's probably just over a year ago. We've known Sabrina for about 6 years. We've done a little bit of work together. I've spoken at an event of hers. And she's done some amazing work in our local community here, helping people and families in crisis, really, and with mental health issues. And it was my conversation with her last year that really helped me rearrange my worldview about, sort of trauma and mental health and my own story and my wife's story. And it helped me my first wife's story, and it helped me understand her so much better and understand what I could have maybe done differently, or a set of tools I could have used at that time. And actually my relationship with Sabrina is what led me to meeting Ed and Eddie V. And that's really what got me on this whole kick of emotional validation, which has actually given me a new set of tools to help a lot of guys, also yourselves included, also learn this skill. So, I mean, a lot of good has come out of my relationship with Sabrina. And so I wanted to bring her here so to give you guys some more information around emotional IQ, trauma, invalidating experiences, and to help you understand maybe why you or your loved ones, do some of the things that they do, and to give you some more insight and tools into helping them and helping yourself. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Sabrina, and I'll let you maybe give a little bit more detail on your introduction, and then we can get rolling. And thank you very much for being here on behalf of everybody. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. So I am going to go through this slide deck. I'm not going to read everything on the slide. This just talks a little bit about who I am and what I do professionally. The reason we do this is to establish some credibility with the audience, but really the important thing about this is that I do have disclosure. And so my disclosure is that me speaking to your group today is just solely a representation of myself and my own beliefs and ideas. So I'm not kind of representing an agency here today. So that's important for you all to know, because I do work for a mental health organization, but when I do lectures like this, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, my private counseling practice, coaching, training that I do. And so some of my beliefs kind of fall outside of the traditional mental health system. So I love when Jason says I'm his favorite mental health practitioner, but I want him to add the caveat that doesn't actually believe that there's such a thing as mental illness. So if he can sort of work that into his introduction somehow. I do believe that we're all human, and we all have human reactions to human experiences. And sometimes our reactions fall kind of outside of the box that society calls normal, and that presents some challenges. But I do believe that we're still on that spectrum or that scale. So having said that, my hope today is to talk to you guys about a very brief introduction on some what I call emotion health. I believe that a lot of the things that we call mental health or mental illness today is really stems from emotions, right? And so difficulty processing emotions and managing emotions. And sometimes that looks like what we today call mental illness. So what I wanted to introduce is just some ideas around emotion health, invalidating experiences, or sometimes we call it trauma, how that kind of impacts us, what happens to somebody when they struggle emotionally, and ways that you can help somebody who is, and then ways that you can help yourself. So does that sound like a good agenda for 90 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, good. And everyone can hear me okay?
Yep. Yes. Yep.
Okay, yep. Perfect. So if Jason, I guess I'll let you as the moderator kind of stop me if you think that I need to maybe explain something better, or you feel like you want to add something to the conversation. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, and if anybody has a question, I know you have a list of questions, but if there's something that tweaks any of the guys at the moment that they want to jump in and ask a question, you'll see like a chat pop up at the bottom there. It'll start flashing orange, I think.
Oh, okay.
And you can just pop that window open by clicking the chat, and you'll be able to answer the question in the moment if anybody has one. So feel free to jump in, guys. We want this to be fluid and want it to serve you.
Absolutely. So, and Jason will tell you I'm very, casual, and I want this to be organic as well. That's kind of how I operate best. So just really quick, and again, just touching on some of these ideas. So we know that the influences on emotion health, or if you want to call it mental health, are more than just biological. So it isn't often that someone is just born with something inside of themselves that is going to be mental illness. In fact, really worldwide, that is only 1%. So 1% of the population will have something that is not as it should be, that will lead to, regardless of what happens in their life, lead to some mental health issues. And so you probably will hear in the media sort of some of the media campaigns around mental health. You'll hear this stat 1 in 5, right? Which is 20%. So why the discrepancy? Because for most people, why they struggle is a combination of biology, how they're born, but also some factors that happen in life. So psychological, spiritual, social. And so it's the interplay of our biology and the things that happen to us, our experiences, that could potentially cause a challenge. So, and oftentimes people become frustrated maybe with a loved one, or even with yourself, when we look to the medical system to, fix a problem, and maybe your loved one or yourself, you've tried medication and that doesn't completely solve the problem. And the reason being is there's sort of these other factors that interplay. And so very often medication is not the only key to recovery. In fact, medication alone is only helpful for that, like I said, that 1% who really just have something biological happening and nothing else. So psychological factors would be things like trauma and invalidating experiences. In the spiritual realm, it doesn't, we're not talking about religion, we're talking about feeling of connectedness and meaning and purpose, and our social influences. So that's kind of who our community is, who our family of origin is, who our friends are. And so, so really it's the interplay. So if we look at this further, the biology piece is whether or not you're going to have a vulnerability or sensitivity to what happens to you. So what that means is that depending on how we're made, so that's our biology, we will experience or interpret what happens to us differently. So if we have a vulnerability or a sensitivity, when something, happens, so we're going to call them invalidating experiences, or if we have if we grow up in an invalidating environment, being a sensitive person or having certain vulnerabilities will increase the likelihood that this is going to cause a challenge. And this is why different people having the same experiences will have a different reaction and a different outcome and different perceptions. And so in a family, I could talk to, and I talk to a lot of parents, and I can talk to parents who have, 3 children, and they will say, maybe my middle child thinks they had the best childhood ever. My firstborn child thinks, it was okay, it was fine. And then my youngest child maybe thinks that it was the worst, it was the worst experiences. We were the most rotten parents. They had a horrible life. So what is the difference if they all grew up in the same household, basically raised the same way, same amount of love and attention? So the difference is biology. So the difference is that we all come into this world with a certain set of traits and characteristics and maybe vulnerabilities or sensitivities, or resiliencies and strengths, but some of that is predetermined. Things like our aptitude for IQ, for example, or how how sensitive or soft-hearted we might be, or whether we're going to be an introvert or an extrovert. Some of those things, whether or not we have a learning disability, some of those things are predetermined. And a more sensitive person will experience the things that happen to them in life in a more sensitive way, i.e. they will have a bigger impact from those things. And the reality is we all have we all have invalidating experiences. We all have disappointments. We have parents who divorce. Maybe we have to move a lot as children. We have a third grade teacher that picks on us, or maybe a, best friend who does something mean. We get invalidated multiple times every day. And so what's the difference? So a more, and I don't want to say sensitive as being a character flaw. Sensitivity is not a character flaw. Sensitivity might just mean that someone has, if someone has a soft heart and has a deep capacity to feel, that is not a flaw, that's a gift. And those are our healers. And those are our people who do great things in the world. But it comes at a cost. So the cost is that you feel things more deeply. So it could be that, but there's also lots of other things that make us more vulnerable. So this interplay of vulnerability and invalidation. So we know that some people have wildly invalidating experiences and grow up in wildly traumatic environments. So we can say, we can say that we know that abuse, for example, sexual abuse, neglect, if somebody has grown up in war-torn country or they've experienced something catastrophic like 9/11, of course we can say, oh, that's an invalidating experience, or they had an invalidating environment. But you know what? Here's the reality, and this is how the interplay works. If somebody is extremely resilient, if a person is extremely resilient just because they were born that way, they might not have long-term impacts of those wildly traumatic experiences, or they may have minimal impact. But then you can have somebody who is born more vulnerable for lots of different reasons, and they can have what we would perceive as less traumatic experiences, like some of the ones I named already, like, parents divorcing, moving a lot, something that we might not call trauma, and somebody could still be very, very emotionally impacted by that. So before I go on to talk about trauma, a little bit about trauma, are people clear about that interplay and how that's different for everyone? Does anyone need me does anyone have a question around that before I go on? No? Okay. So what I'm used to when I teach, in front of people, when I can see people, because I'm looking at my screen now, my PowerPoint, I can't see you. I'm used to feedback of, sort of people's expressions on whether or not they're still with me. So I'm going to keep going. And then if someone's not still with me, then please somehow send a message to me, and otherwise I'll keep going. So I want to talk a little bit. So what are invalidating experiences? And I put the word trauma on this slide because trauma is what we hear. We hear about trauma-informed environments, and we hear about people who have been impacted by trauma. And I want to explain what trauma is, because I think in our minds, in the minds of people I talk to, especially family members who say, well, my loved one hasn't had any big trauma. But when I start to talk to them and unpack exactly, or people will say to me, they haven't had trauma, but what exactly is trauma? What are we talking about? And it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It doesn't have to be 9/11. It doesn't have to be years of brutal sexual abuse. trauma can be explained as anyone that a person does not have the intellectual or emotional capacity to understand at the time that it happened. Okay, so if for example, a young child is experiencing like a divorce of parents, and if they don't have the internal resources to understand that, and they're not provided with the external resources to understand that, then they might have some misunderstanding or some confusion around what's happening. And so that might cause some internal conflict for that child. So that's an example of something that might be traumatic. And it doesn't mean that, you know, it might not be something that, you know, you might go, oh, you know, that was a big trauma, but it was traumatic for that child. And so what happens is there can be an accumulation. So we can accumulate experiences that are confusing or troubling, and it starts to shape how we view things. Now, invalidating experiences are where our emotional needs are not met. So I'll use the same example. So you have a child that's parents are going through divorce. They don't understand. Maybe they think they did something wrong, or it's somebody's fault, or they have some confusion or misunderstanding. And then so they might be suffering or struggling, and nobody acknowledges that. That would be an invalidating experience. So their needs in that, if mom and dad are too consumed with the nastiness of the divorce, may not meet the emotional needs of the child. So that's an example where, you know, that may be something that somebody carries into future relationships and transactions with others. So even though, like I said, it doesn't have to be a widely recognized big event, but these accumulation of smaller events where the person, and it can be an adult, does not have the internal or external resources to manage what's happening to them. And that's trauma. And so what happens is, again, sometimes people start to develop some beliefs based on their experiences that they don't really have the capacity to understand at the time. So just kind of to recap that interplay of nature and nurture, so biology and experiences, some of the sensitivities that people can be born with, they might be emotional, soft-heartedness, it can be cognitive, so people who have cognitive processing problems, or where the capacity they have for IQ maybe is a little lower, that causes a lot of confusion. So an overly emotional person will be hurt more. Somebody who has cognitive difficulties may not understand. They can be physical health related, so sometimes people have physiological disorders where it impacts their ability to kind of process emotions, yeah, so I'll leave it at that. I'll talk a little bit more about how people get physiologically stuck. And some of these challenges can be genetic in nature, and that just means we inherit some of these sensitivities or vulnerabilities. So sometimes you'll see in families a pattern of people who are maybe reactive, for example, or have their feelings hurt easily. You see this a lot when we talk about genetics. We see this a lot with addictions, and people don't really know this piece of how addictions works in terms of heritability, because people will always say addiction runs in families or it's inherited. That's not exactly true, although we do see addictions running in families. The heritable factor is the emotional sensitivity, okay? So we can inherit that that sensitivity, or that not irritability, I'm trying to think of the word I'm looking for, reactability, okay? And how addictions plays in is people who are hurt more easily and carry more emotions need to medicate more. Okay, so the heritable factor is the emotional vulnerability, and substance use tends to be one of those relatively easy in the beginning anyways, things that people can access to manage their pain, their emotional pain.
Hey,
So,
Sabrina.
yes.
I'm just going to jump in here because there's a couple questions. So, hey, Jeremy, you mentioned being adopted, and that's something that's come up a few times. So when Sabrina talks about invalidating environment and inappropriate responses to painful experience and emotional needs not met, I mean, does that resonate with you, in your experience of being adopted?
I'm not really sure. I'm trying to figure that out,
Okay.
But I think it does. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I saw you posted it.
I'm trying to process all this as she's talking about it, and I have a lot of things going through my head, and I may have a bunch of questions here in a minute. But, yeah, I'm just trying to process all that and let my brain soak all this in.
Sure.
Okay, perfect.
And Jeremy, just so you know, I'll leave my contact information at the end if it takes you a while to sort out your questions. And I do work with a lot of people with some it would be attachment trauma. So adoption is an example of attachment trauma. So you can always send me your questions after if you have to. Okay.
Thank you.
And there's one other question from Scott Sherman. So can it happen in reverse, where an insensitivity, say someone who tends to be emotionally distant, can be equally problematic?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so where that comes, one of the ways that comes into play is when we, our environment reacts to us, right? So for example, if somebody is, and I can't think of an example right off the top of that particular thing, but if somebody's personality is more introverted and more likely to sort of withdraw, right? Then their needs are less likely going to be met because the environment doesn't know how to give them what they need because they might not necessarily know. Does that make sense? So somebody who is maybe a little more resilient and doesn't need anybody, then doesn't actually get offered help. Is that who was
so
it that
you don't allow the environment to respond to the needs when you have them because you're not particularly good at expressing them, perhaps?
Absolutely. And I'm gonna show you a picture of a transaction model, and that's what exactly happens. And so let me go through, and when we get to that slide, if it's still not clear, then you just let me know, okay?
Thanks.
So some examples, and these are just some examples of then the environment, are inappropriate responses to painful experiences, emotional needs not met, an accumulation of small hurts or trauma, feeling of disconnectedness. So here's the reality. Regardless of how the environment treats us, if the person themselves feel disconnected and feel not heard or not accepted, then that's hugely invalidating. And it might just be a matter of the environment not knowing how to give the person what they need. And Scott, if I can, if you'll indulge me to share for a quick minute, I'm one of those people. I am one of those people that just keep going. Like, I just keep kind of, muscling through, and I'm, reliable Eddie, and I don't ask for help because I'm just that person. I kind of have this kind of fortitude, but guess what? People assume always that I'm okay. And so when I'm not, people aren't going to necessarily reach out to me because they'll assume that I'll just manage. And even when the rare occasions that I've really asked for help, I think I get not taken seriously because it happens so rarely. So that's an example of kind of that, is our environment reacting to us? Okay. And so it's most important how the person feels, whether or not they feel heard, understood, and connected. versus the efforts that are made by people to make them feel that way. It's whether or not the person really feels that. So, yeah, okay. So I am going to keep going. This is what happens when people have a series or a big or a series of experiences where where their needs are not met, okay, when their emotional needs are not met. It could be that they internalize these negative experiences and they form some negative belief systems and negative beliefs about themselves and their place in the world. I'm just gonna take this with my teeth. This is very problematic. So having a negative view of yourself or your place in the world or the society, like having those negative beliefs is very problematic because it's the lens that we look through, okay? And sometimes it changes how we perceive experiences moving forward. So one example here is, you know, if I have feelings of incompetency, so my internal dialogue is that people think I'm incompetent or that I'm incompetent, then when somebody gives me, for example, maybe some constructive advice, I will hear it as criticism. And that may trigger me. That isn't, I just want to say, when I say that isn't an example from my own life. But that's something that most people can relate to. If any of you have young, you know, teenage daughters or family members, you know that a lot of them struggle with some low self-image or some low self-esteem when it comes to how they look. So looks are very important, very critical to them to make them feel good and worthy and lovable. And so if a young female doesn't think she's pretty, you know, or attractive or doesn't look good, and that's very important because she has low self-esteem, but really her internal dialogue is that she isn't attractive. What happens then is that's the lens that we kind of are looking out of. And so maybe, you know, mom or dad trying to be, you know, helpful and complimentary. We want to boost this young girl's self-esteem. So, you know, mom or dad walks in the room and says, oh, hey, you know, you've done something different with your hair. It looks lovely. Meaning it to be a compliment. And the daughter, you know, throws up her hands and says, oh, thanks. You know, you mean to say it looks like shit every other time. You're always putting me down. You never say anything nice. Thanks for ruining my day. I can't go to school now. And so what was perceived out of that comment wasn't, you look nice today. What they heard was, it's different and it looks nice. And the assumption they made was that it's not nice every other time, because that's the belief. Okay. So that perception of, you know, judgment, hurt, scorn, abandonment, whatever the perception is based on the negative belief, that becomes a trigger. That's now a trigger for that emotional pain that someone's carrying. And we're going to talk about what emotional dysregulation is. But often it's our negative beliefs that set the tone for us to have, you know, maybe these, you know, these easy triggers for dysregulation. My daughter, for example, if I can use it, you know, feels very incompetent as a new mom and as somebody who struggles with her mental health. And if I were to suggest anything to her, she sees it as criticism. And that isn't a reflection of what I'm saying. It really is a reflection of how she feels about herself and her ability to parent right now. So I have to be very mindful of how I word things, because getting advice is a trigger for her because she feels incompetent. Is that making sense?
Yeah, hey Sabrina, I just want to jump in because I think I mentioned this in one of the masterminds last week, and I'd like your opinion about it. But I've been reading about this idea of coherence, And the idea being like, so for example, if we've internalized these negative beliefs about ourselves, then in order to create a coherence between our inside view, our inside world and our outside world, we will actually, so for example, if we feel like crap about ourselves, we will actually seek out people and situations that confirm that belief. So we'll hang out with people that either treat us like shit or whatever, and which just kind of, you know, creates this cycle. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know if I agree totally with maybe I certainly don't think people are conscious of doing that if they're doing that. But what I think, we gravitate towards people who might understand us, right? So I think because that's validation, right? So being validated is being heard and understood. And I think people gravitate to people who might have a better understanding of that, like internal climate that they have. Because I'll just use the example of my daughter again. She often feels very misunderstood by me. And in fact, I probably do, because I don't experience that emotional pain that she does. So it's very hard for me to understand. I think she probably gravitates towards people who themselves have been depressed, who themselves have struggled, because they can empathize with her better than I can. I can try, but it's not coming from a place of experience. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying what you read or that theory is wrong. I think it's certainly, if it happens, not intentional, for sure.
Thanks. That's great insight.
Okay. Yeah. So was there any other questions before I keep going?
Anybody want to jump in? Let's just see.
Is this making sense? Jason, you can see everybody. Are people nodding? Is this making sense?
These guys never look like anything is making sense. So yeah, so I think you're making sense.
Okay. All right. So I want to talk about emotional dysregulation. So what is this? I know Jason, you know, if you guys have been doing some work around validation, he's probably explained this, but for people who have not been part of that dialogue, we'll just do this is basic biology. And there was probably folks on this mastermind group that know more about biology than I do. But to simplify things, okay, everybody gets emotionally dysregulated. Everybody, okay? The example I used from my life is about 1.5 years ago. I was rear-ended at a red light. And this particular day, my emotional sensitivity was probably a little heightened. I was running behind. I was rushing. I didn't get time for lunch. I was rushing back to the office to meet with a client. It was Friday. It was summer. So I was thinking about all the things I had to do to be able to start my weekend. And I'm parked at a red light, a block from work, and I get rear-ended. And so my moment of emotional dysregulation that I'm embarrassed to admit is that I jumped out of my car in the middle of downtown, ran up to the very elderly man in the van behind me and slapped my hand beside his open window and probably quite in his face said, screamed, "Are you fucking kidding me?" And I was just in this irrational moment that thankfully didn't take me long to kind of calm down. And I was so embarrassed by my behavior. Actually, I didn't even make him pay for the damage. I said, just be careful when you're driving. But the point is we all get dysregulated, okay? And it's not a problem for most people. There are 10% of the population who become dysregulated easier and more on a chronic basis, that it causes challenges in their life, okay? So it goes like this. So there's some emotional sensitivity present. So for some people, it's biological and ongoing. For others, like myself, I think it was in that moment, tired, stressed, weekend, Friday, in a hurry, right? I was a little more sensitive in that moment. But there's some emotional sensitivity present, and then there's a perceived hurt or danger. So that's the trigger. And I say perceived because it can be not imaginary, but it could be our perception that there's danger, not that there's actual danger. So there was a meme on Facebook that went something like, our prehistoric brain doesn't know the difference between a saber-toothed tiger and an email from our boss. So you get an email from your boss and it's, you know, not favorable, and you kind of have that same sort of fear response. So that's basic biology. And so when we perceive hurt or danger, we have a sudden, intense arousal, and that's our fight or flight response. And that's activated in our amygdala, which is our brain's alarm system. So when the amygdala gets activated, because we perceive a critical comment from our mother, or a slight, you know, some judgment from our boss, or we, you know, come across a bear in the woods, whatever the source of the danger is, we have that sudden intense arousal. And when that happens, when that brain has been activated, we are irrational, or we can be irrational. So that's when our emotion mind takes over our reasonable mind. And in this emotion mind, when we're solely in emotion mind, our cognition is impaired. We lose the ability to solve problems, make decisions. When it's very heightened, when the dysregulation is very heightened, we have a very slow return to baseline. And this is when people resort to some maladaptive coping strategies. So this is when people drink, drug, shop, have sex, you know, have a blowout fight. I'm trying to think of some other things, self-harm, talk about suicide. It can look like anxiety. It can look like anger. It can, you know, it's those intense feelings where some irrationality is happening. And the person is fighting really hard, has to fight really hard to kind of get calmed down. For people who, so for the typical person who this doesn't happen a lot, our return to baseline is relatively short. Like my car accident, by the time I returned to my office, I was completely calm and rational, and I called the insurance and did what I had to do to manage that. So that's because it doesn't happen that often, okay? But for someone who it happens often, and I don't know how to put this on a chart that I can put on the computer, but basically their baseline changes. So instead of needing a big, huge, real trigger to get dysregulated, they need less of a trigger because their baseline now is already leaning more towards dysregulation. So when they have that peak, their peak goes higher, so it's more irrational. It takes longer to return to baseline the more you're in this state. Something else happens, which I took out of this PowerPoint because I know we only have 90 minutes. So, this activation of the amygdala is our sympathetic nervous system. And what happens once we go, our sympathetic nervous system brings us into the state, then the parasympathetic nervous system comes in to calm us down. But what happens when we're always getting dysregulated and we're always needing to calm down, those two points intersecting, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system intersecting constantly causes problems, because the sympathetic nervous system is like the gas. So if we were talking about a car, so for all you car guys or guys, so sympathetic is the gas. So when there's something, when we need to flee, our body presses the gas, and that's go, okay? Parasympathetic nervous system comes in to slow it down because we can't operate on that high rev. That's the brake, okay? But when these two things are always happening at the same time of a chronic nature, it's like having the gas and the brake on at the same time. If you did that in your car over long periods of time, you'd burn out your engine, right? The car would break down. And so that's what also happens in our body. So our nervous system starts to have malfunction. And we start to get in these both physiological and psychological states of immobilization. So dysregulation itself causes brain dysfunction, because if it keeps happening, it changes our chemistry. So the hippocampus is quick to activate the amygdala, the hypothalamus stops trying to regulate. What this means is it increases our biological sensitivity to being triggered emotionally. So the more we're emotionally triggered and in a dysregulated state, the easier it will be to happen, okay? Because our brain chemistry changes. And so I don't know if you know people who are just like, they just are off and running at the slightest little, inconvenience, or, likely that has started to change their brain chemistry. So their biological sensitivity increases. And then when that parasympathetic keeps coming in to then stop them or freeze, our freeze response, because it's fight, flight, and then freeze, it's like then always applying the brake. So from a physical standpoint, it causes pathology in the body. So we're talking about autoimmune disease, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension. So it's causing pathology in the body. And from a psychological standpoint, it's that immobilization as well, where you have, like, you need to change, and yet you're stuck, you can't. Like, you got to go because there's danger, and yet you don't leave. You do nothing. And so it can be psychological immobilization. And then the physical immobilization are things like chronic disease. Okay, so those are some long-term effects of being in this emotionally fueled, dysregulated state.
Hey, Sabrina.
Yes.
Two questions around that. So going back to your earlier notion that the biological problems that we tend to, or the problems that we tend to use drugs to fix, really only being present in 1% of the population, does this change that? Do people who are not born with that gain something, and that's why we're seeing more of a drug usage, A, and B, does the rise in interconnectedness from the internet via social media or instant news, or the things that ramp us up and calm us down over and over and over during our daily life, contribute to this in your
Absolutely. So I'm going to answer that question first, because we ended on that. So that's why we see a vast increase of emotional dysregulation in our young people. So we will see a spike or an increase in our millennials. I don't know how old you are. I can't really tell, but our 33s and under at this point, because what happened was that they have access to the internet. So too much information. As a species, as humans, we are not evolving emotionally and intellectually as fast as technology. So we're losing the ability to keep up with the amount of information we're given. And so you'll see a spike in dysregulation in millennial generation, and a wild spike in our generation Zs now. So millennials are Ys, and then the 20 and unders are Zs. And the difference for them is they grew up with social media. And I'm telling you, it's scary. It's if you do what I do, and you see every day our young people struggling with emotional dysregulation, and they're having eating disorders and addictions and self-harming behavior and suicide. And it's, I don't know what the answer is, but we are now knowing that the impact of those things is huge. And so I'm gonna, is that for that question? Is that okay for that
Sure.
question? So your other question about medication. So yes, so what happens is we can, that 1% that's born with it, then we have other people who kind of develop some biological sensitivity. So that part, and that's your other 19 of the 20% that struggle. And because I'm speaking for myself, I can say this. I am not a huge proponent of medication. I am especially not a proponent of medication use for situations where people are struggling emotionally. And so even though it causes some biological sensitivities, we have no medication that fixes emotions. And so if somebody is in a really, really high level of distress, so much so that they can't do the work, the other work that they need to do to feel better, then I don't want people to suffer. So I would say some medication use as an interim, but all the stuff that I'm talking about now really, I think is best treated outside of our traditional medical model. So does that answer your other question?
Yeah, I guess I was kind of thinking about the interplay there. Is do people get? Does the environment cause so much dysregulation that they don't have the ability to respond in their traditional sense, doing the emotional work, and therefore may need a crutch to get them to that level to where they can process what they need to grow?
Absolutely. Not a crutch so much, but I would call it an aid. So yes, there absolutely are people that need an aid to get to the point where they can actually be rational enough to do the work, for sure. That's a good way to put it. Thank you. So I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna talk about person. I'm just checking with time. So I'm gonna keep going.
Hey, Sabrina, I think we have one more question. Dave, do you want to jump in and ask?
Yeah, thank you. I just have a quick question regarding the physical effects you talked about, being the freeze. Would that apply more? Like, I know for me, I'm a less sensitive person, so very, very hard for me to kind of understand and process emotions, but yet have been in like a very emotionally invalidating environment for kind of the last 6 years, and have got real kind of physiological effects. Would less emotional sensitive people be more likely to manifest physically, or is that kind of just dependent on the environment and the person?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, what I can tell you is stress, right? Anytime we experience stress, there's a long-term impact. So because when, whether we're good at processing our emotions or not, we all kind of process stress the same way. So there's stress hormones that get released in the body. You've probably heard of cortisol and adrenaline, and they have effects on us physiologically. So the biggest ones are autoimmune dysfunction, and then some other, and that manifests as, and I don't know what your health things are, but that manifests as chronic pain, inflammation. I don't know if any of this is ringing a bell for you, but yeah.
Yep.
All reversible, David. All reversible.
Yeah. No, that's good. I'm working on it.
Yeah, good. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Jason, you think it's okay to keep going now?
Yeah, I just told the guys if they have a question for you, just to jump in when they have a second, when you take a pause.
I don't see, I haven't seen a orange button chime in anywhere, so.
Yeah, there's been lots of questions. But anyways, I just told the guys when it makes sense, they'll just jump in and ask.
Okay, all right, because I'm not seeing anything, but I believe you. I'll let you manage that, okay? So I want to talk for a minute about personality. We all have one. And our personality is made up of our thoughts, feelings, and we can call them reactions or behaviors. And so our thoughts, feelings, and reactions get repeated over time. And this is what forms our personality, okay? And there are aspects of some people's personality that presents challenges for them, and prevents them from having the life that they desire. So a lot of times, I'll be honest with you, what we call mental health issues is personality challenges, okay? Now, in our DSM-5, which is our most recent diagnostic statistical manual for mental health, there's a category there in the Access to Diagnosis category of personality disorders. I can't tell you how much I hate that term. I think it's awful. I think if our personality is who we are, and saying we have a personality disorder is like saying we are flawed or broken, and who we are isn't acceptable. So I think it's an awful term. I don't ever use it. But what I will say is I do believe that people have some challenges that arise from some of the personality traits that they've that have evolved, that have become fixed and rigid over time. That's what happens. Our personalities kind of over time become fixed and rigid. So, and it's not that they can't change. It means that we have to do some hard work to change how we think, feel, and react. And currently there is no effective pharmacology or medication that will alter someone's personality. And I think that's the frustration, is somebody is might be not, this might be a loved one or someone or yourself, where you're constantly making decisions or doing things that are affecting your quality of life and how you want to live. And maybe you go to a doctor and maybe you try different meds and things don't change. And so again, we have to be really mindful that pharmacology is not the only solution, and it really only changes things dramatically for a very small few. So if it's a difficulty in how we think, feel, and respond to things that happen to us, we need to do some work around that. That's work that we need to do for our life to be different, okay? And so I just wanted to kind of make the distinction between mental health and personality and emotions. Like, if we can start to unpack what all of those things are, then we can understand. Certainly understanding ourselves better gives us ideas on then what we need to do to see the change that we want in our lives. Changing one's personality, the older we get, the more difficult it is to change certain aspects of our personality. So probably a lot of sort of that, I call them curmudgeons, but the 80-year-old neighbor that you have that just is always kind of cranky and has a negative view. Well, first of all, it doesn't mean that he can't change, but it will be very difficult for him to change. And he would have to be very motivated to do that work, and it would probably take him a long time and a lot of perseverance. It's possible, but I think, but we have to have motivation to do it, and we have to persevere. And so I think our frustration sometimes with people who have challenging personalities is that we want desperately for them to change. But, unless they do that hard work and are motivated, how they think, feel, and react to situations is probably going to be pretty consistent, because personality is predictable in some ways. Okay. So I'm going to talk about, and one of the gentlemen was asking me about this in terms of getting what we need. And so this is, and Ed, hi Ed, you'll be very familiar with this, this concept. So that I want to talk about the transaction model. So if over here if you're looking at the screen on your left where it says arousal, so let's call that dysregulation. So somebody is highly aroused or dysregulated. And what happens in that state of arousal or dysregulation is that they often inaccurately express how they're feeling. So, using the example of the young girl who got very upset when her mother complimented her hair. So she was highly aroused because she'd been triggered by some feelings of maybe not being attractive and insecurity. But how she chose to express that, or not chose, how she expressed that was not reflecting her pain and hurt about that statement. She didn't say, "Oh, Mom, that really hurts my feelings because I really am feeling badly about myself and wanted so desperately to look nice at school today. Can I have a hug?" Like that, that's not what the highly aroused person does. the highly aroused young person says, you never say anything nice to me. You're always putting me down. You know, effing bitch, I'm not going to school. Screw you. And the door gets slammed. Okay. That's how intense pain or some variation of that gets expressed, which invites or provokes or it's provocative to the person experiencing this because it elicits an invalidating response from the environment. Because of course mom is gonna what? Defend herself, say that's not true, tell her she's being unreasonable, tell her she has to go to school, it doesn't make sense to not go to school. Like, so that inaccurate expression of the arousal is inviting an invalidating response. So once the individual gets the invalidating response, they feel what? Misunderstood, not heard, invalidated further, and their arousal goes up. And so this tends to get repeated over and over and over again. And so for the support person or the loved one, it's very frustrating because they don't know what they're saying wrong. And for the person who's in pain, guess what? Their emotional needs are never getting met. So they're further invalidated, which makes them just a traumatic experience. So that's how that works. Any questions about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to share an experience from my own life. How I did this happen to me all the time. So with my first wife, who was basically emotionally dysregulated most of the time, and she had feelings of great shame and frustration and isolation and all of these things, and they would all come out as anger. She would get extremely upset and they would come out as anger. And what I would do is I didn't have any of the tools to even begin to imagine that there was something else going on other than her just being angry. And so I would give her nonstop invalidating responses about how she should just get her shit together and how she should, being angry about something like whatever the thing was made no sense and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think it's something that, especially, and now having teenage daughters, I mean, thank God I have the skills to be able to do this right, or at least better most of the time, because, when a teenager gets upset, man, it's hard to know sometimes it's hard to know what the actual thing is. And if you just responded to the original upset, you'd create a situation where you were giving nonstop invalidating responses.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I am also glad you have, if I had this knowledge and I have to tell you, we don't know what we know until we know it, right? I mean, when my daughter who's very, very sensitive, and I probably became more proficient at this, I would say, in the last 5 or 6 years, and she's 28 years old now. And man, we fought when she was a young person. And we didn't have a good relationship, and I constantly offended her, and I was constantly disappointed by her offense of me. It was awful. And so I as well am glad you're learning these skills before you have to go through that. And especially with our young people now, they're struggling more, right? They're struggling more than they have ever before.
Hey, I wanted to have, are you still here? Are you on the call still? Where is he? Is he still here? Javier. Can you hear us, Javier? Oh, there you are.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, so I wanted to just bring you in here because I know that you find yourself.
Can you see me?
Yeah, I can hear you, man. So I wanted to bring you.
Yeah,
in.
I'm here.
So I want to bring you in because I feel like you probably find yourself in this particular situation a lot. Would you agree?
Kind of give me a little recap of it. I just lost you for a minute. I was in and out.
Yeah, so we're talking about how when people get upset, they can inaccurately express their emotions. So say when
Yes.
when your wife is super, super angry, with you, and what might be going on might be something else underneath the surface. Like it might be some other emotion, but she's expressing it via anger, and then you invalidate her by saying something about her being angry and how it makes no sense, or telling her to calm down or whatever.
Yeah, that's all the time, man. And go ahead.
Which would further escalate her, right?
Absolutely.
Which would, yeah.
Absolutely. So, and lately it's been happening so much. We're actually just now coming out of a really bad little last few days. So she's expressed lately that she has some really embarrassing things that she needs to talk to me about, but she's not ready yet. And that is what she has also admitted, that's what causes these problems that we have, a lot of them. When it's coming from her, I'm not saying I don't cause problems, but when they're coming from her, these things that she's repressing are causing a lot of problems between us, because she only knows how to react in anger to any situation, whether it's like you were saying earlier, I may be complimenting her and she takes it the wrong way. It turns into a fight. The kids aren't doing what she's saying. It's anger. Whatever, everything is anger. And so I get really flustered with it. I haven't been really good at validating her feelings. So I immediately kind of start firing back and saying, you're just an angry person. You're crazy. I don't know what you're doing. We didn't do anything to deserve this anger coming from you. And I'm just really not understanding where it's coming from. I'm starting to now. I don't know what exactly it is, but I'm starting to understand, that it's something else, not me.
Well, if you lost us for a second later on, maybe you might want to just go back and listen to the last bit of explanation I did, and then from here on in, the next thing I'm going to talk about is sort of anger as not being a primary emotion. So if you can stay tuned, that would be great.
Yeah.
It would be helpful. So the dysregulation often comes out as anger. It doesn't always. It can be anxiety, overwhelmed, panic, but a lot of times it's anger. And so in a dysregulated state, what somebody is expressing usually is not the primary emotion. So when it's anger, especially, so anger is very rarely a primary emotion. And I don't know, most people who are dysregulated do not have the cognitive capacity to articulate what exactly it is. So when somebody's in a moment, like I said, the young girl, when somebody's in that moment of dysregulation, she's probably doesn't have the ability to articulate that it's really a feeling of low self-esteem and wanting to fit in. What she's presenting is anger, or for my daughter, it's overwhelmed. So she'll throw up her hands in a total state of being overwhelmed by everything. But so what we are presented with is a secondary emotion. So what's usually driving this dysregulation is some primary emotion. So this little picture I just put in front of you, we're going to look at anger. So if anger is the tip of the iceberg, what is under the surface? And so this gentleman just said, his wife often gets angry, but now recently she's talked about something embarrassing. So what is driving that might be some shame, some guilt. I mean, what are some other emotions here? Feeling attacked, not having trust. Fear is a big motivator of angry, right? So fear of, the gentleman, again, I'll just use his example, like the kids not listening. Okay, so the kids don't listen to you. What might you be scared of? That you're going to lose control. Maybe that your kids aren't going to turn out okay. I mean, there's lots of stuff that drives, lots of stuff under the surface of the water that drives how we react and how we behave. And a lot of people don't even understand it themselves. So the person experiencing the anger probably doesn't know until they unpack it and talk about it and process it, really what is driving that. But as somebody who's witness to the anger or the distress or the dysregulation, one of the things that we can do is, be curious and start to try to understand what's lurking under that water. So I stuck that in because Jason had specifically asked me about anger not being a primary emotion. So I found that diagram that I've used before. So I thought I would share that with you. From my own personal experience in the work that I do with people who, are on that journey of self-growth or self-discovery, it's a lot of fear. I hear fear. I hear feelings of inadequacy. I hear lonely. I hear, disenfranchised, disconnected. So those are some of the things that I think are recurring themes for people. Insecurity. Those are some things that drive some of our sort of irrational behavior at times. Those are the common ones that I hear anyway. So if we don't have any questions about that, I'm gonna, so what do you do? I wanna first talk about how you help somebody else who's upset or dysregulated, and then I'll talk about what you can do for yourself if you think you may be at times driven by some emotional stuff. So for somebody who's dysregulated, what they need, so they are feeling insecure, they are not feeling safe at the moment. So how you may put them on secure or safe footing again is by showing them that you hear and understand their position or their pain. So the word validation, a lot of people think they understand what validation is, and most people, what they think it is isn't truly what it is. So validation is an expression of empathy. Can be verbal or physically, but verbal expression or physical, so it can be a touch or it can be words, but it is showing the person that you hear and understand them in the moment. You accept them in the moment. You hear and understand their position, their pain, their point of view. Okay, so that's validation. It's an expression of empathy. Empathy is a deeper level of understanding. And validation is how you show somebody that you have that deeper level of understanding. So it's a universal emotional language that can be used to communicate with someone when they're in distress. So when somebody is irrational because their amygdala has been triggered, they are not hearing logic, reason, ration. They're not hearing all the good advice that you're trying to give them or the suggestions that you're making or they aren't hearing that because they're dysregulated, okay? So you have to be able to talk to them in the way that they're gonna hear you, calm down, and be in a more rational place so that maybe some change or some positive, this can go in a more positive direction. Validation is the art of affirming, so the experiential appreciation of another person's worldview. It's accepting the person for who they are in the moment, and it helps them feel heard and understood, and it decreases their distress. So it's better positioning them. It's getting them out of that dysregulated state and better positioning them to think clearly, problem solve, make a good decision, not add to the crisis and chaos of the moment. So if it's in a disagreement, if somebody stays dysregulated, then maybe the pot's going to go flying and the door is going to slam and they're not going to talk to you all night, which further compromises the relationship. If you can validate how they feel and calm them down and get them on a more secure place, then you might be able to come to some resolution or agreement or middle ground where, the fight happened, but then you can kind of go on with your night and it doesn't, compromise things further. So validating someone doesn't fix them or change them, but it minimizes or reduces the pain in the moment, and it makes it easier for us to kind of manage our interaction with that person and for both people to leave with a little more integrity. Okay, so that's what a validation does. And why do we bother doing this? Because this is a review, when someone is in a high state of arousal, there is less processing of new information. There is no new learning and no therapeutic change. And that's why we keep going same transactions over and over and over, because they're not learning anything from this, because they're in that dysregulated state, during that exchange.
Hey, Sabrina.
Yeah. Hi.
Could you take us through an example of how you would validate, like using your example of the teenage daughter freaking out about the hair? Just
Sure.
how would you validate that situation?
So if I was going to validate that situation as the mom, I would say, oh, I've said something that hurt you. I mean, it's clear. And validating is not including or agreeing. But make no mistake about it, the girl is hurt, right? It doesn't mean that mom meant to hurt her, but she's hurt. So I might say something like, I've said something to hurt you. That statement I made, that obviously wasn't helpful for you. You're worried about how you look, and me saying, that comment has caused you some more stress today. So do you see how validating sounds? It doesn't not try to convince the person. What it isn't is I'm not saying, oh, that was a compliment. I'm not always putting you down. It's not defending my truth or my position. It's acknowledging the other person's. Now, in this scenario, it doesn't mean that as a mom, I can't get there, but I need to get this young person calmed down before I can say what my true intention was. So I might continue to validate if that's, if I'm still needing more validation. I might say something like, I can imagine how much pressure there is at school for you when you're trying to fit in and look a certain way for your peers. I can't imagine, in this day and age, what that's like for you. You have much more pressure than I did when I was young. And so, maybe I might say something like, I can see how important it is for you to fit in, and to fit in, you feel like you need to, look good. And I've just now said something that makes you question whether or not you look nice, and I can apologize. I don't have to apologize. I don't have to take responsibility for saying something wrong, but I can acknowledge that wasn't helpful for her. So I can say, I'm sorry for, saying something that was not helpful for you today when you're so stressed about looking good. So as I start to see a de-escalation or that the person, the young girl now is calming down, and we can have a reasonable conversation, then I might say something like, as bad as that felt, are you willing to accept that it was not my intention to hurt you? And I really was trying to pay you a compliment. It didn't come out the way I intended it. So does that sound like what you thought it would sound like, Andrew?
Yeah, it does. It helps hearing the example instead of trying to think of one in my head.
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked. And I often do workshops where the sole purpose of the whole half day is practicing validation, because it is not easy. Okay. And there are 6 levels of validation. So there are lots of ways that we can validate people. And so literally I do whole sessions on just that. So if you guys want to do more of that, you'll have to talk to Jason. I'm looking at the time, so is it okay if I keep going?
Yep.
Okay. So, and I'm gonna move through some of these slides a little quicker than others, just because I want to get us to the end mark. So, why do we do this? When somebody's upset, why do we validate? So our goal is to minimize the risk, and we just want to not make it worse, right? So we're trying not to do no harm, or we're trying to do no harm, sorry. What I want to say about that is empathy and validation. It's never going to make it worse. It might not work, but it's not going to cause more distress for the person. So compassion is an act of empathy, right? So taking the time to actually do this is a compassionate act. So never is compassion and empathy going to make this situation worse. It might not make it better, but it's not going to make it worse. So the goal is to do no harm. And so we try. It's our best shot. And it could make it better. It's not going to make it worse. We have to remember that this very personal thing is not personal. So it isn't about us. So if somebody's dysregulated and they've been triggered, you know, they're in that moment and something is happening for them, and regardless of what they say and do that feels personal or it feels like an attack, it really is about their emotional space at that time. And so to try not to take it personally is helpful. To interpret things in the most benign way possible, which is really to not interpret. So not try to figure out what's happening or why is actually helpful, and just be curious. I know, Jason, you did a micro episode about this, but I don't know if all of your members heard it, so I'm just going to review. There is no one or absolute truth, and that means that everybody's right in a way, because we all have our own perception. So in our example, the mother's perception probably was, I go out of my way to compliment and boost the self-esteem of my daughter. And the daughter's perception or truth is that nobody ever makes me feel good. People always put me down. Who's right? They're both right? Everybody is entitled to their own truth. And so it's not helpful to try to convince somebody of your truth, because it might not be theirs. And so everyone is doing the best they can in this moment, and everyone is capable of doing better. And that's for them, and that's for us as well. So I'm going to move us along. So one of the things that we talked about in the transaction model is that often somebody's expression is untoward, or it is not inviting us to embrace them in that moment with kindness. What their behavior is inviting us to do is defend ourselves, to set some boundaries, to correct the behavior, which is the opposite of what they need. Okay. And it is human nature to defend our own truth, to say, no, I didn't say that, or that's not what I meant, or, you know, it's not my fault. So that's human nature, and you want to try to not defend ourselves, because remember, it's not about us. It's also human nature to want to try to offer advice or fix the problem. So you're going to want to try to do the opposite of that and not give in to that temptation to give advice. Or in that moment when they're dysregulated, to try to, you know, set boundaries or correct behavior. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have those discussions later. And so we call that invalidating the invalid. So if I can use your member's example of, you know, having these exchanges with his wife, it doesn't mean that they never talk about how harmful and toxic that is to their relationship or maybe their kids, but they do that at a time when they're both calm, right? When there is no dysregulation, because trying to do that in the moment when she's maybe angry and yelling, that is going to affect zero change. So resisting the urge to kind of do that in the moment and save it for a different time. Or even time, but when the person is calm, maybe later in the conversation after you've done lots of validating.
Sorry, Sabrina, Javier had a question.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a question. So, you know, you're talking about speaking when they're calm and all of that. With my wife, it's just been for a long time now. I can't bring up anything. The go-to reaction immediately is anger. Whether she's calm, we could be having a good time, but if it's something that's going to make her uncomfortable, if I just want to talk about, hey, why don't we talk about the budget this weekend? Or, hey, something about the kids, whatever. If it makes her uncomfortable, she doesn't have to be in a bad mood or anything, but if it makes her uncomfortable or she just doesn't want to talk about it, it's anger. Yeah. That's what I was talking about earlier, you know? So it's kind of all the time. So,
yeah. So my next slide talks about that. So I'm gonna defer that to the next slide. And then I also Just want to encourage you, if you need to kind of work through some of that specific to your situation and your wife, then I'll give you some contact information at the end and we can do that. But I think my next slide will be helpful for you, okay? So just to wrap up, so taking opposite action means you're going to do the opposite thing of what is human to want to do. And when a person is dysregulated and when they're maybe being a little irrational, whether it's anger, accusations, or withdrawal, or however they express their pain, that you're going to actually lean in. And I don't mean literally, but figuratively, you know, move towards the person in pain. And so human connection is what will change this transaction. So if someone's being angry towards you, or, you know, maybe, you know, doing something that you maybe traditionally would anger you, and you do the opposite of what you want to do and you show some empathy or compassion, it changes the transaction. And so we want to lean in and not away from the person in pain. It's very easy when somebody is, you know, saying, you never do anything for me, to just say, fine then, if I never do, you know, then I'm going to go. But if you do the opposite, that's when real change happens. And when you hang in, right? And a lot of, I want to say a lot of people's triggers are about attachment and insecurity. So people who are often telling you to leave and get away, or go, you know, leave, go away, and shutting you out, those are the people who need the most attachment. Because what they're really saying is, prove that you love me and prove that you're not going to leave. And so again, it's that discrepancy of asking, of how they ask for what they need, that leads to then people, okay, you know, you told me to piss off, so then I'm leaving. And then they feel hurt and abandoned. And so maybe, Jason, that might, I don't know if that kind of ties into what you were saying about that cohesion, but, and I'm not saying it's a conscious test, but people who are the most insecure about love and acceptance often are the ones who are more likely to push people away, because what they really want is for you to think they're worthy enough to stay. So anyways, that's a bit about that. And I want to address the question about somebody who's just always so reactive all the time that you can't really affect any change. And so we talk about building trust or cultivating trust. And sometimes we just get engaged in the same transactions over and over and over with someone that we just are very triggering for them. And so sitting more in acceptance and less in change to earn back some trust. I took out the slides because I couldn't fit them in, about the dialectic of acceptance and change. But what's important to know about that is, when we want someone to change, we need to accept them for who, I know it sounds weird, but accepting someone for who they are in the moment is the best way to get someone to change, okay? And so validation is about accepting them in the moment. And sometimes when we get caught in these adversarial transactions over and over and over again, we need to stop trying to change that and change the person, and sit more in validation and acceptance for a period of time to earn back some trust from them and us, that you aren't trying to hurt them or judge them or abandon them or any of those things that they are subconsciously feeling, so that they can actually stay more regulated and have a conversation that's more meaningful. So if you feel you're being ineffective in motivating change at the present, invest some time in cultivating connection by simply validating and accepting for a period of time until the other person is less defensive or resistant. So that's one way to look at it. And again, I encourage you, if you have some questions around how you might be able to do that, you can always reach out after. Okay.
Hey, Sabrina, I just want to jump in and say, like, just for some context, this can go on, like, that type, invest time cultivating connection by simply validating for a period of time. That can be a long ass time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for a relationship where where you want to change this dynamic that's been happening for years, it's going to be some work and some time. Absolutely. And I think so for the person who's dysregulated, and it's possible that both people are dysregulated, in which case I would say both people have some work to do. But I also think that for the person who is chronically dysregulated, they need help. They're not going to be able to manage this. Just validating them is not going to change this dynamic, because some of these patterns of thinking, feeling, and reactive have started to become ingrained, and we have some biological stuff now starting to happen. So this person, I'm not saying Hab's wife, but the person who is constantly in the state of dysregulation, they need help. So they need some nervous system help, they need some therapy, they need some support. They will not know how to do this on their own. Okay, that's the work. Now, there was a question that came in prior about people being able to do this work on their own. And so I would say so for people who aren't chronically dysregulated and in this state like a lot and locked in that pattern, they can do, if it's just some minor things, people can do that work on their own. But for people who really are psychologically stuck in this pattern of behavior, they need some help to do this. But the person in the relationship certainly can start to cultivate some trust to make this more possible, to make change more possible. Okay. So I'm gonna, why is this hard to do? So why is it hard to validate someone? Because it's counterintuitive. So we are accustomed to interpreting people's experiences and solving problems with logic. So, you give me a story, you tell me what happened at work, I interpret that to mean something, and then I'm gonna give you some ideas or some suggestions on how to change that. That's what we do. That's intuitive. So it's counterintuitive to not do that and to do something different. And that's our Western culture, right? So in our Western culture, we don't promote or encourage emotional awareness. People don't know how to do this. So there are in other cultures and other places in the world or other settings where people are intuitively more empathic, not our Western culture. So that's why it's hard. And I hope that, through forums like this and people are interested in learning. I mean, I don't know how many guys on this call, 10 people, you must have been interested in learning some information about emotions. So we can learn this, and we absolutely can have a deeper level of understanding that's helpful for ourselves and understanding ourselves, and helpful for understanding the people we love. But it takes, I have a colleague of mine who listens to me speak a lot. I do a lot of workshops, and sometimes especially when it's clinicians, when I'm teaching clinicians, sometimes I think, why are they not getting this? It's not that difficult for clinicians. I think, you should be able to pick up on this. And, I had a colleague of mine saying, Sabrina, it's like emotional rocket science. So when this is not information that the general population has or easily understands. So, it is difficult. It's a change. We have to make a conscious change. And so another reason it's difficult is because, how do you empathize with someone when you don't think like them and you don't feel like them, right? And so it's hard to have that deeper level of understanding because you can't imagine it. And so you have to dig deep. And so for my daughter, because my daughter and I are so not similar, we are opposites. I'm kind of like this positive person, and so I'm Tigger and she's Eeyore. Okay, I don't know if anybody, gets that reference. And so it's very hard for me to understand why things are so hard for her, because I don't get it. So I have to dig deep to try to compile all the information I know and stories of clients and how people have described to me how they feel, to conjure up this understanding of how hard it is for her. Okay. To be able to empathize. because I don't think like her and I don't feel like her. But if we want to try to understand people, we have to try to find a way to maybe to put ourselves in their shoes as much as we possibly can. And then the other reason it's hard to validate, and I'll use Hab's example of, you know, his wife gets mad and then he reacts and now he's mad too. So it's difficult to stay in a calm and rational state that we need to remember these skills that I'm teaching you and apply them when we're having an emotional response to the actions of others. So if somebody's, you know, yelling in front of the kids and you now are triggered because you don't want the kids to hear that, then you're not gonna be particularly empathic and validating that moment because you're dysregulated too. So there's lots of reasons why this is difficult, and yet it is so very possible. And so I've talked to you a lot about how to, or not a lot, but some about how to support somebody else. But what if you're the person who thinks that there are times when you get maybe emotionally triggered or get a little dysregulated, and in that moment say or do things that maybe afterwards you're not proud of or you wish you'd done differently. It's, you know, making decisions. And so like, you know, maybe spending, you know, going out and buying a car impulsively and afterwards thinking like, why the hell did I do that? And, you know, so if you're somebody who would like to better understand your own emotions and emotionally driven responses and choices and reactions and behavior, and you feel like there's things that you would like to change to make your life, you know, more the way that you envision it, that change is possible. And that work of unpacking that and making some meaningful change is absolutely doable and possible. And so what I would recommend that you do is find somebody you trust and connect with to help you on that journey. And when I say somebody you connect with and who you trust, is sometimes the first person whose door you walk into is not the person who can help you. Jason and I had this conversation, and I think sometimes we have to shop around for a coach or a counselor or a therapist, just like we shop around for anything else. And I'm a critic, like, you know, and I've sought help at different times in my life. And because I do this work, I'm the worst critic. And if I don't feel like somebody has the particular skill that I'm looking for to help me on my journey, then, you know, you have to look for somebody else. And so I would encourage you to do that. And the reality is we all need validation. Okay, so every single person needs validation, and it feels good for all of us to share our experiences and challenges in a non-judgmental, compassionate environment. And the worst thing is to have a struggle and to have somebody, you know, be judgmental or not compassionate. And people do it unintentionally all the time. People will say, you know, a comment or, you know, make a suggestion that, you know, isn't helpful. And when we're feeling bad and we're not validated, it makes us feel worse and it gets more confusing. And so I think having a support person or a, you know, whoever you seek out, like I said, coach, counselor, therapist, when you walk in the door, feel that you feel like you are heard and understood in a non-judgmental, compassionate way, that is helpful for most people. And, you know, and I am not, you know, the guru of all gurus, but I know that when somebody leaves my office and they say that it was really helpful, I know I've done a really good job in validating. And so we all need and deserve that as humans. And expressing ourselves out loud helps us gain self-awareness and it helps us heal. So, so those are things that I would encourage you to do if you feel like any of this has resonated with you. Jason? I can't.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, there you go. Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay, so that wraps up, right? Like,
well, there's some, yeah. So we have some time. So I have questions that were sent in advance, and then I have if anybody has any questions from.
Yeah. Did you want to just go through the questions that were sent in advance?
Sure. So these were the sent in advance questions. So, and I think, you know what, I covered a lot of this information, so I think I can answer these very quickly. So can two similar events happen and one has no impact and one stays with you? Absolutely. So the difference is that we are more or less vulnerable at different periods of time. So, you know, say you lose a job, and I'll use the example of losing a job. So say you've lost a job twice in your life, and one time you lose a job, you're married, your family life is going pretty well, you know, you're in a relatively secure place, and you lose your job and you have lots of resources and support to manage that, and you're okay, and it has no impact. And then maybe 5 years later, you're going through a rocky divorce, finances are strapped, you know, the kids aren't coping well, and you lose your job. Do you think that's going to be harder on somebody and have more long-lasting effects? Absolutely. So I think two similar events can happen, and how we experience them can be different based on our situation at the time. So that's question number one. So if you have an identified trigger, how do you prepare yourself in the future? Now, I summarized these questions, so they were quite lengthy kind of questions with examples, but I put them down to kind of one sentence. So I apologize to the people who sent these questions. But if you have an identified trigger, so I think the example was something's happened in the past. I know that it triggers me. How do I prepare myself not to be triggered in the future? So really it's about planning ahead, right? If you have insight and you know yourself because you've done the work, you know what your landmines are. And we plan ahead and we avoid the landmine. So I know for me, I'm a traveler. I love to travel and see the world. But because of my childhood, a very transient, moving all over the place, things never being secure, living out of a suitcase, I know that one of my triggers is transition, because I like to be kind of like safe at home, and I like to travel. Now that could be a problem for me if I didn't know how to plan ahead. But I know for myself, when I travel, that I need to take the day off work before I leave to be packed and totally organized. And I know that process is going to be a little more drawn out and painful for me, because I have to remember everything that I'm going to need to be comfortable and be really, you know, feel good about, you know, leaving. And then I also know that I have to do that coming home to transition back into home, to have a day to unpack, do my laundry, put my things away. When I go to a hotel, I also know that the first 20 minutes aren't going to be grab your bathing suit and go to the beach. I need to spend 20 minutes unpacking my clothes. Now, it doesn't mean that I couldn't do it that way and I would manage if I couldn't, but I don't want to put myself under undue stress, so I plan ahead. So that's an example of how we can absolutely do that. How do you better prepare yourself to handle trauma in the future? So this is somebody who's asking about, I have not had much. He says, I haven't had trauma, but I'm worried about how I might handle trauma in the future. For example, losing a loved one. How do I kind of better prepare myself for that? And the answer to that is, the more generally, emotionally, physically, and mentally healthy we are, the more resilient we are. And so it means when we eat healthy and exercise and get sleep and nurture our relationships. And, you know, when we do those things, we are making ourselves less sensitive and vulnerable and better positioned to handle trauma when it happens. So next question, can I do trauma work on my own without therapy? This also was a long question, and so I pared it down. So the person was saying that they don't believe they've had trauma, but if they want to try to figure it out and how that impacts their life, do they really need therapy, or is there something they can do to do this journey on their own? So I know I said earlier, somebody who's chronically dysregulated needs help. But for this particular person who said they're not really sure they have trauma, this is somebody I'm imagining, if you're not really sure you've had trauma and you don't really have any significant issues, that you just really kind of, it sounds like more exploring being the best person you can. I think for somebody like this, absolutely, we can do this work on their own without therapy. And so again, because I'm a big critic, I've done a lot of my work self-study. So I think if someone is insightful and motivated and has a direction to look in, like maybe after today, somebody might say, oh, I'm going to look more into the central nervous system and how that operates, or I'm going to look more into, you know, something. And you start to kind of, you know, look in and read and explore and connect those things with your own personal life. I think it's absolutely possible to do. And as I said, because I do this work, I'm pretty critical of therapy in general. So I've had some negative experiences where people have done everything from fall asleep in a session to cancel, you know, last minute 3 sessions in a row, like all these kinds of things. So I'm wary. And so I've done a lot of this work on my own because it is possible if you're insightful and motivated. So I hope that answers that question. So again, I think I answered this in the presentation. Is there a difference in experiencing cumulative trauma versus one big event? And no difference. So people can still have, for example, some people are diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people have that diagnosis because there's been like some big significant event, like, you know, they've witnessed a highway accident or something. Or it can be, you know, sort of these smaller invalidating experiences that, you know, happened over years. The person, how they function in the end could look very similar. So they both could have symptoms of what we call classic PTSD, you know, whether it's small accumulative trauma or one big event. So how do I understand a teenage girl, her trauma, and whose world is falling apart? You know, really it's about trying to understand. Well, how do you understand? You listen, right? You listen, you try to put yourself in their shoes. You try to see how might that have been for somebody in her, you know, with her particular challenges, and you listen to what they're saying, right? That's how you understand, is by patiently and persistently listening to the story. And then the second part of that same question was, how do you repair the damage of the perception of a teen, of the teen girl not having her father present in the way she needed? So if her perception or her truth is that she did not have her father there in the way she needed, that is her truth, right? And you repair the damage of that truth by validating that truth, you know, by acknowledging, you know, that is, for all intents and purposes, that is what happened to her. And so when the person stops defending their position and justifying why, that will start to repair that damage. So that's all my external questions. Does anyone have any other ones?
I've got a quick one, if that's okay.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Did you have a?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
That's right. It's a teenage girl question again. I've got a daughter who's extremely sensitive. She's stuck in a lot of negative beliefs and thought patterns, and it's almost like she's determined to stay there. Like, she's super resistant to absolutely any like external positive work. She knows, like, because we've been on that journey for a year or so, you know, doing all the positive. She's just so super resistant to any of that. It's like she's just determined to stay, you know, hating herself, come rain, hail or shine. Is there anything? And, you know, we're doing our best to understand and validate, but that's still a big work in progress.
Yeah.
Is there anything we can do on the positive, like when there is non-conflict times, to try to help her on the whole dysregulation side, or understanding herself? Or it just seems impossible at the moment.
So does she have anyone that she works with? Because to be honest with you, I mean, it's not work that you can do. I think you can validate and empathize and understand to keep her regulated, but that doesn't mean you can have the skill to actually do work for her to change. Does she have anyone that she talks to that?
We've tried. It's super hard.
Yeah.
Because we're out in the country, and she's just so super resistant to seeing anybody. Like, she's like a closed book. You know, we managed.
something called dialectical behavior therapy. Do you have that? Have you heard of that?
No.
Dialectic, it's DBT. It's called DBT, dialectical behavior therapy.
Okay.
So that is very helpful. But also, when you said, trying to be positive, our psyche defends its position. So if she's feeling very negative and coming from a pain position, the more you try to be positive and shine, convince her to be positive, the more her psyche says, no, I'm in pain. You need to hear me and listen.
Yeah.
So I would, it's almost like I tell people, you gotta swim in the murky waters with her a little more, rather than trying to convince her that it's not that bad. Let it be bad, and kind of, I'm being figurative, but like wallow in that with her a bit, because the opposite effect will happen. If you wallow with them for a little bit, the psyche starts to then not like that either, and they turn towards the more positive. Now, these are kind of deeper level concepts, and that's why I think like somebody to help her and help you navigate this is very helpful. But you can shoot me off an email so I can recommend a book for you, and I can tell you a little more about DBT and maybe connecting her with somebody online if you don't have access to resources in your community. You can talk to someone like me over Skype or, okay?
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Hi, Ed. I can see your little...
All right. Is anybody? Did you have something, Ed? I see you're unmuted. Or
no. I'm just wanted to say hi.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody else have anything for Sabrina? This is your chance, guys. All right, going.
My contact information is there if people are too timid to speak up.
No, these guys aren't timid.
I know that was a little rushed. I apologize. We had Jason and I had a lofty agenda for 90 minutes. I think he didn't believe me, but.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. So, okay, well, listen, if there's no further questions, I wanted to say on behalf of myself, obviously, and Jeff, my cohort, and everybody in these masterminds, thank you. That was hugely valuable. And I wanted to say to you guys, if you looking at this, if you recognize in your own life, in yourselves or in your own lives, somebody that could benefit from working with someone who I cannot, I can give my highest recommendation. I mean, reach out to Sabrina at her contact info. She's helped tons of people. She's helped me immensely. And she's a wonderful person. So with that being said, thank you, Sabrina. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And I will record this and post it in the group because I'm sure it's going to get rewatched a number of times.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. I can see you now. I unshared my screen. I can see you now.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.